Welcome to the Futureneering Podcast. My name is Philip. The aim with this podcast is to highlight some of the incredible science, technology, and innovation happening in Australia, and some of the key individuals who are helping to build the future. This podcast is sponsored by Neurotech. Neurotech have created Enhance, Australia's most advanced and comprehensive nootropic formula. Enhance is a nootropic, or brain supplement, that combines 10 natural ingredients, including B vitamins, plant extracts, and amino acids to help support your mind each day. In particular, Enhance can help support and enhance your mental alertness, your focus and clarity, help maintain your nervous system health, and support your energy production. Enhance is also a listed medicine on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. This means that it has been formulated, manufactured, and lab tested to some of the most stringent standards in the world. Neurotech also offers a 100-day, 100% money-back guarantee. So if Enhance doesn't work for you or you don't love it, you will get your money back. Listeners of this podcast can get 15% off today for Enhanced Nootropic by simply using the code Futureneering. Just visit www.neurotech.com.au and use the code Futureneering to get 15% off Enhanced Nootropic. On today's episode of the Futureneering Podcast, I am joined by Viraj Agnihotri. Now, Viraj studied bioengineering in India before coming over to Australia to study a master's in both innovation and mechatronics engineering. He also went through an accelerator program at the University of Queensland, built his first startup called Augmented Bionics. They were trying to develop a medical device to aid people with hearing problems without surgery. After going through ups and downs trying to develop this technology, he realized he couldn't develop the technology and generate real revenues in a realistic time frame, and so he exited that startup. And now he's working as a Commercialisation Manager at Australian National University, where he's trying to help researchers commercialize and develop their technology and turn it into real, tangible products. Now, if you're interested in engineering, deep technology, medical devices, research and commercialization in Australia, definitely listen to this episode. I'm so excited to dive in and talk to Viraj. Hello, Viraj. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Futureneering Podcast.
Hi, Philip. Thanks for having me.
So I just want to get stuck right into it. Can you give us a bit of a background as to your journey, what you studied at university, a bit about your career, and sort of where you're at now?
Sure. I think so I was always curious about science fiction, generally very interested in it, and that sort of led me to join engineering, but specifically bioengineering back in India. I think my main area of interest was brain-computer interfaces from start. So very, very inspired from science fiction movies, and that led me into that. So I was studying bioengineering in India, and during my sort of third year, I had this idea to build something which was essentially an augmented reality brain communication device. So what I wanted to make was something that can communicate human experiences from one brain to another brain. The way I thought that would happen is you can, let's say, record the sensations from one person through, let's say, an EEG, and then you can transmit that into another person. So what that allows you to do is almost be actually in someone else's shoes. So if you aspire to a sports person, you can play in their shoes. If you want to do skydiving, but you don't want to do actual skydiving, you can just, absorb that information from someone else. So that was the gist of it. So this was back in 2013, and I believe this was sort of before Neuralink came out as well. So that's what was going in my head. But for me, it was very clear that it has to be something that's non-invasive. So, for what I was making, people would not get an implant in their head to do that. So I looked into technologies that can allow for that, and found something called transcranial magnetic stimulation. which is the same principle as your wireless chargers. So rather than putting a wire in your phone that charges the batteries, you've got a coil which emits magnetic pulses, and that can charge the batteries in your phone. In the neural context, those magnetic pulses, when focused on nerves, can actually start action potentials, or essentially fire the nerves. So there were ways to activate certain nerves in the head without going in. So that was the big idea. Started talking to different professors how to go about doing this, but the whole vision was a bit too much science fiction, quite frankly, like too big for an undergrad.
Okay.
Yeah. So had to narrow it down and put some focus around it. And that's when I started sort of looking at implantations and things like that. So I thought, let's go one sense at a time. We've got different senses. I started with hearing because I used to play a lot of instruments, music instruments. So I thought sound is my thing, and that's where I realized the market gap. So my understanding was people with severe to profound hearing loss, 99% of them don't have a device right now. So the market leader is Cochlear, an Australian company. But there's a very few people in the world who have access to cochlear implants. And that's where that remaining 99% of the market was the gap that I identified. So this whole broad idea morphed into making this non-surgical, non-invasive bionic ear. So that sort of got to our focus. I tried to do it back in India, but I couldn't find the right people with the right expertise. I was in the most premium engineering institute at the time, and even there I really struggled to get the right people because there was no one in India who's made cochlear implants before. So you have to surround yourself with the right people with the right expertise. So hence I came to Australia after my graduation in India. I went to UQ. I also wanted to learn how to get innovations to market or ideas to market. So my first master's was in technology and innovation management, and then I used the courses as part of that curriculum to build a business case for this idea. So did all the market assessment, IP strategy, product development plan, all that was done as part of course projects. And then once there was a clear need in Australia as well, I went back into engineering, did another master's, and this was more in the Mechatronics side, designed sort of magnetic stimulation coil system that could stimulate the hearing nerve. So that was enough data to file a patent. Built a team with the with my course mates who had met during my masters. So we had one engineer and we had one guy from biotech. So I figured we'll need both kind of people. And then we just went into UQ's accelerator, started the company. 6 months in, we raised our first round of investment. That was from Artesian. And as part of the medtech actuator program in Melbourne. A bit after that, I think a year or so, I think 2020, mid 2020, we raised our next round with IP Group. So first round, a lot of it was making some basic proof of concept. So as I said, the patent was mostly just simulation data. So it was about building our first prototype, doing some business plans as well, like concrete business plans like regulatory strategy, reimbursement strategy, clinical trial strategy. So using consultants to get like a proper pathway forward on the business side of things. And then with IP Group, I think we had a two-tranched investment. The first one was to do animal trials. Guinea pig was the animal model of choice. If that would have been successful, we would have gone to first in human trials, but we sort of got stuck in that. And I think the main bottleneck there was COVID really slowed things
Yeah.
down. So what we thought would take
Okay.
us a month to make, we barely got the parts of that prototype in a month. So it really took us more than 6 months to build our first prototype, despite having the basic sort of circuit schematics ready already. And then there was scope creep as well. We partnered with UNSW and Macquarie University. So UNSW had the expertise in animal trials, and Macquarie University had the expertise in hearing. And I was from UQ,
Okay.
so we were leveraging UQ's capabilities to help us with the engineering things, especially power electronics. You do need some safety aspects to the prototype, so UQ helped us sort of identify those and mitigate potential risks. But we essentially just tried with one guinea pig, and we realized we need another prototype with much stronger output, and we just didn't have the money to, we just ran out of our capital because it took us so long to get to that very first prototype. But
Right. Okay.
we had instances where we ran out of capital and we just removed all expenses altogether and just kept going. So we had faced that situation before. We're just operating without much. So, not deterred by that, but I think the main factor that we found was that we need to do a lot of investigational science first, before we build a prototype that we know would work. So, for example, we knew, this has been done a little bit. Like there was a group in Germany in 1994 who stimulated the hearing nerve with a magnetic coil, but that was it. There was just one publication that we found later down the line. So we know it was
Yeah. Okay.
possible, but nobody had done that with a guinea pig. And the guinea pig one, it's really small guinea pig head, so you need to focus it more than you need to focus on the human head. So in that way, it was more difficult. But then the guinea pig nerve would activate on different intensity than the human nerve would. And you almost need to have a prototype to investigate what intensity would that fire on. So you're going back into science rather than commercializing research. So that's where investors
Yeah.
also thought that this is going a step backwards. I think that was one main point. The other main point was we really looked at other magnetic stimulator manufacturers. So magnetic stimulation is used for like antidepressant therapy, bit of physiotherapy, so stimulating different parts of the brain. And other than the first two that came out, all the other companies were still raising rounds of capital 15 months in. Like we saw there were companies that had done 2 IPOs, so none of them seemed to be profitable. And their product was like 100 times simpler than what we were trying to make. So not only
Yeah.
would it have required us 10 years to make our first product, to get profitable, it would have taken another 15 years. So then it becomes a question of, is this really the only thing, that you want to focus your life on? And
Yes.
that was one factor. The other factor was our prototype was, it's not coming on camera, but let's say the size of a CPU, like a good gaming PC
Okay.
CPU, but 30 kg, so heavy. Getting that from that size to a smartwatch, let's say, or a headphone that you can wear for 8 hours a day and it works, required energy consumption reduction from 10 to the power 4. So 10,000 times reduction in energy consumption per magnetic pulse.
Yeah.
And that was just something we did not have an idea how that would be achieved. They were like minor innovations in different areas like batteries or like power electronic circuits, optimization of coils, materials, things like that. But we couldn't see that clear path that, even if we have all the money that a startup can get in Australia, and even if we have the best talent, we didn't have the right technical strategy to address those problems. So the challenges became more suitable for a research institute rather than a startup of 3 master students, really. So the scale of the problem became so large that it wasn't suitable for first time founders with no capital really, practically speaking. So yeah, that was the other factor. And then on the personal side, I had a baby on the way, so the startup lifestyle was quite risky. As I said, like we had on and off with money, no money coming. So having a baby, you need stability in life. So that sort of removed my personal risk-taking capacity as well. Our patent had reached the national phase already, so it would have gotten very, very expensive to maintain. So there wasn't really an option of, okay, keeping this on hold, we can maintain the patent on our own, and then let's just keep building part-time. That wasn't the option. So it was, just close this, start something else. So that brings us to August 2021, where I started the role in ANU. So I'm a commercial development manager here. Essentially, the role is to get ideas from the lab to the market. So it's a big process. It is a lengthy process. So it's more about progress. Like the day-to-day looks more about progressing technologies along that pipeline. You get to sign licensing deals or spin out or acquisition. That's a bonus. But I've been here 1.5 years. Having done this myself for my own tech, it takes time. And with ANU, a lot of the work we get is in material sciences. So a lot of the work happening in the more fundamental space. So that even takes longer to get to market. There are techs that I have right now that are like technology readiness scale like 5 or 6, so almost ready to go out there. Here I sort of mostly look at, I do have some medical device, like got 1 or 2 medical devices, but mostly I've now been going into physical sciences, which is like engineering, physics, chemistry as well a little bit. The portfolio is mostly looking like renewable energy, primarily.
I just want to say, incredible story, just everything you've gone through and everything you've done. And there's a lot of crossover between sort of my world as well. We've done a lot of similar things. I believe we both went through the iLab Accelerator at UQ for completely separate things. Yeah. But I just want to go back. I have a bunch of questions to ask you with sort of the first part of your story with building the startup, and then we want to get into the second part.
Yeah.
So basically, you're in India studying bioengineering. You came to Australia, went to UQ, did 2 masters in innovation and another in mechatronics engineering.
Yes.
The first question is, how did you find the masters in mechatronics? Because I've also been considering going back to do my masters there.
Yeah.
Did you think it was useful, or was it very...
I think so. The exact degree was masters in engineering, and then there was a specialization where you do your thesis in the mechatronics stream. I would have preferred the electrical engineering, but I didn't get that because I didn't have an undergrad in electrical engineering. So because my undergrad was in bioengineering, they sort of gave me something, but it did allow me to do my thesis in electrical engineering essentially. I found that particular master's that I did was quite broad and generic. There were like courses on experiments, how do you set up engineering experiments, or engineering in practice, which was quite broad and it's abstract. There was, I think, control systems was a good course. I didn't do well in that because it was like a level 2 course. I didn't have a prereq. I hadn't done the prerequisite, but I still passed. So that was good for me because I was on a timeline to start my company. But it did allow me to work on my thesis in parallel to starting the company. So there was a time when I was doing 2 masters at the same time. So the second semester, third. So the first one was 1.5 years, 3 semesters, and the second one was 2 semester 1. So the third semester of the first one and the first semester of the second one was overlapping. So I got to, you could do like open electives, you can transfer between different things. So project management, as an example, was a course that was applicable to both the masters. So that's something, I could overlap a few courses here and there. But that was quite a heavy workload. but not so much. Like like coming from India, I've found that the academic load here was quite low. We used to do 7 courses full time in every semester. So doing 4 or 6 wasn't that much. So it was light enough to allow me to pursue something that I was doing. But yes, you can definitely intensify it depending on what courses you choose. I think the purpose of why you're doing that should be very clear, because it is time consuming. I did learn good amount of things from that. But yeah, mostly it was for the thesis that I did that master's. Yeah.
And the thesis you did for your master's, was that directly related to your startup? Were you actually working on some sort of medical device and building that out?
Yeah, so the thesis was exactly, going back to the technical, because so far, like after my first master's, all I had was an idea in my head and some idea of what are the base technologies, but not really a functioning idea of like a working knowledge of that, and like a validated market need. So I need to go back and actually build the thing. So it was a 1-year thesis, and I just did simulations, designs of different magnetic coils, to see if the hearing nerve can get the right amount of voltage, essentially.
Yeah, perfect. And did you join and start at the iLab Accelerator while you were still doing your masters as well?
It coincided quite well, where I finished my second masters in November of 2017, I believe. 2017, and then December was the iLab intake. So it was like quite perfect.
Perfect timing.
Yeah.
How did you find your time at the accelerator? What did you do during that period?
I think iLab was really, really good. One, it was the first sort of dive for me into the startup world. Working in sort of that agile way that Monday you all set up targets publicly, and then Friday you have an accountability session, really worked well. It allowed us to bond as a team as well, the co-founders, because I was working on this since like 2013-14, and then I got my teammates in iLab Accelerator essentially. So getting to know them, building that rapport. We did get like a lot of advisors during that time. I think something that we did well was we got really, really experienced people as advisors. We had 2 Order of Australia winners, let's say, in our advisory board. All you need is like a few conversations with them. Like their experience is so good that just one chat with them guides in the right direction. So we built that. We partnered with Hearense, which is this sort of series of hearing clinics in Australia. And one of the advisors was from there. We built these sort of networks of, let's say, professors in different areas at UQ. So UQ was really good in that aspect as well. You pretty much had everything at UQ. So we found a professor in magnetic stimulation. We found a professor in audiology. We already had a professor in, let's say, electromagnet design. So, the thesis that I was doing, we also had a professor in animal trials from the UQ vet side near Toowoomba. And we also eventually got a professor in power electronics. So, I mean, almost every discipline that we needed was already in UQ, other than like deep hearing and animal trials expertise specific to us, where we went to UNSW and Macquarie. But iLab was really good in that sense. What was different about that, because I kind of did 3 accelerators. One was iLab, one was the ARC one, which mostly my team did because I was in India. That happened during my wedding. And then the medtech actuator. So with iLab, these are the good things that I've basically mentioned. The other side, which was not maybe the best, was the different types of startups there. So the way people, different startups have different pathways, different constraints. So yeah, it's just like, one team's talking about has anyone generated revenue? And I'm looking at that. I need 10 years to even launch my product. But has anybody looking at curing blindness? Because that's something we were doing as well. So we just, wasn't just hearing. Our patent covered a lot of different nerve stimulation.
Yeah,
so
very broad.
Yeah. So even like retinal, some like eye diseases as well, you can stimulate the optic nerve. And we were looking at other nerves also where we could get, because essentially the tech was like almost like a platform where your ability to focus and stimulate nerves deep inside the head was what we were developing, and then you essentially pivot that to different clinical applications in the long run. But yeah, coming back to iLab, it was really good as a first experience into the startup world. The medtech actuator in Melbourne was a bit better because it was more tailored to medical devices and the challenges and timelines that we would look at in our industry.
Yeah, okay. So early in your life, you had this big vision, this broad vision of, I want to create these brain-computer interfaces that can sort of connect people's brains so people can feel other people's sensory inputs and things like that. And then you sort of narrowed down that vision to hopefully create something more realistic, and that's where you focused on sort of the hearing side of things with your device at Augmented Bionics. I wanted to ask, I know a bit about transcranial magnetic stimulation as well as transcranial electric stimulation. Why use one over the other? So why did you go down the route of using magnetic stimulation? Was it not feasible to go down of using the electrical stimulation? Can you explain a bit about the differences there?
Yeah, and it's been like a while since I've got back, like it's been more than 2 years now. But essentially what we found was it was very difficult to focus electric stimulation, like the current just spreads along the least path of resistance. And the nerves we were targeting were behind this bone that you touch here, and it's quite like weird shaped. I think it's the temporal bone. Yeah. So that is quite weird shaped. So we needed something that independently of your bone shape or the conductance of different tissues can still have the magnetic, have a deeper stimulation side. So the way it worked was we had an array of magnetic coils. By themselves, they would not be sufficient to excite a nerve. So because you've got nerves on the skin, there are other nerves in the ear as well. But when it's like the principle of superposition, so you've got multiple smaller fields focused on a point, and at that point it becomes large enough to stimulate the nerve, which this sort of approach didn't seem to be possible with the electric stimulation. Also with the electric stimulation, there's tingling that you feel. We've tried it on ourselves as well. So one of the prototypes we were trying to do for demonstration is, can we, there's like 5 fingers, let's say, and each of them has a nerve. So we wanted to show that we can stimulate different nerves as well with our prototypes. So we were looking at electric stimulation versus magnetic stimulation for your motor nerves, and what we found was when you put an electric stimulation, it does tingle. It's a current at the end of the day, so it does tingle, and if you raise that in intensity, it sort of starts hurting a bit, whereas your magnetic stimulation really doesn't. So it was much less painful, almost nothing there. The only thing with magnetic stimulation that we found was a potential side effect is because we tried to recreate the German experiment as well. We didn't have the same coils, so the coil shape really matters. So the one we had was unfortunately stimulating the jaw bone. So when we tried that, it was our jaws were moving. So
it would clench your jaw muscles almost.
Yeah, so if that was the intensity started going up, then that started hurting. But again, that the coils we were testing were commercial coils for brain stimulation, not really this side of this side of focus. So so that that was the only downside of magnetic stimulation. It is difficult to focus. You see a magnet, everybody's seen that north-south diagram. Magnetic lines flow like this, not like this. So it is sort of difficult to focus them as well, but that's where our array design was. So the first prototype we built was to essentially demonstrate this focusing, but not inside the head, outside. So we had a very small 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter sensor. We had to make the sensor on our own as well, and we could show that we can move around the focal point within that small space, which is the same size as the human cochlea, which is essentially the microphone of your head. That was the main rationale behind electric and magnetic stimulation.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, for those who aren't really that familiar, so basically, I'm assuming the magnets are in accordance with electromagnetism. Essentially, they're inducing a current and electrical activity in certain nerves based on the changing magnetic field.
Correct. Yeah.
And you have to obviously be very precise then in terms of designing sort of those magnets and those coils, like you said, to target that specific nerve area.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So, you were saying that basically in the end, you were probably too ambitious, I guess, in terms of you were trying to forward the technology, but you sort of had to go back to do some of the preliminary science, and it would probably just take too long to sort of get to where you needed to be and start generating those real revenues. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think that also sort of comes to the path of doing, starting a startup versus doing a PhD and going into academia for a while, developing something there and coming out of it. Then, longer path to startup. The dilemma there was that at the time, my understanding was that UQ's policy was the IP created by PhD students is owned by UQ. Which is not the case in other universities, which would have meant that if I would have done a PhD, UQ would have owned everything. So all the outcomes.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I thought that was the case across most universities, that the university would actually own the IP.
That was my understanding for UQ at that time, and I think that was correct. It may have changed. I haven't looked at that policy, but for for master's students, that wasn't the case. Hence, what I built for my master's mostly had me as an inventor, but I also had my supervisors contribute to it. So it became a jointly owned IP between me and UQ. But if I would have been a PhD student, unless I had a special agreement that, that only I keep the IP, UQ would have gotten that. The other thing was, as I said previously, I wasn't an electrical engineer. Most of the device was electrical engineering. So I would have had to learn a lot of skills to build it myself. What I figured would be better is to actually get people who are skilled enough together to build that. So, I was focusing on the coil design, which was basically electromagnetism, something that I learned in my first year of undergrad. Really, that was the basic science, but it was just about using the simulation tools. But then there was power electronics, because these magnetic pulses need to be very high voltage. As I said, the prototype's quite big. So my co-founder, our CTO, was an electrical engineer. There's also signal processing for the audio part, which we didn't really get to because there were other problems to solve first. But if there would be, there were about 7 disciplines that I could sort of think of that I needed to upskill myself. In the 3 years time, what the outcome I would have had, let's say in a PhD, at the max would have been that prototype that we built as a team. But I also built a company in the same time. We raised capital. We had so much more exposure from following the company route rather than the PhD route, where would have been just the technical part. We got there anyway, so it was different. So my goal was always to start a company rather than just one device, because the vision was much broader than just one thing. This one thing had the most market potential. That's why we focused on that. But yeah, the vision was always to start a company. But I still don't have a solution to, whether how exactly would that have worked out, because startup was not the right vehicle to do that science. It's startups are meant to just sort of take things forward and have a very clear commercialized market, product at the end of 5 to 6 years. The other thing that I learned along this journey was venture capital firms have their own timelines for their funds in which they need to give returns, which is many of them have 10 years. So they would invest in the first few years, but then they need that return back. So you need to show an exit, or the investor needs to have their exit by the end of 10 years, which was very difficult for us. So we, like some of the deep tech investors basically just couldn't fit because their fund was already in year 5. So they were interested in what we're doing, but yeah, just because it would have taken us much, much longer to get any returns, so it wasn't the right fit. But yeah, so that was the other thing, where the timelines were so long. IP Group has much more sort of appetite for longer timelines. They work slightly differently, hence, we had a good fit with them. But yeah, it's to develop product, not to go back and do fundamental science.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've definitely seen a bit more of an emphasis now in Australia with VCs going into deep tech and helping startups bridge that valley of death, they would call it, sort of the path between the initial preclinical research and getting a product that's actually generating revenues. So it's good to see that we're investing more in tech and actually the scientific process of getting something commercialized.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about your experience with that, because I haven't had experience raising capital from venture capital funds.
Yeah.
You raised an initial round, I think, of about 500K. Is that correct?
No, so the first round with Artesian was 200K, and the second one was 650K. Okay. We had gotten some like prices as well. Total we got was about $1 million with R&D tax and everything included. I think different investors work a bit different.
Sorry. Keep going.
Yeah, so I mean, different investors work differently, and it sort of depends on their investment thesis. So the first investor we had was Artesian. My understanding of Artesian is that they invest a little bit in a lot of things. So hence the smaller investment. So it was interesting because when we finished our iLab program, we had a target to raise 800K. That is what we figured we needed to get to a good value inflection point. But we were so early, like as I said, we just had simulation data really. Nobody would give us 800K. But if you realize,
so
retrospectively, we got 200 and then 650. So it's just that we knew the amount that we need to get somewhere. It just came very slowly over many years into different, buckets of investment. So with Artesian sort of strategy, they invest quite diversely, but little amount to begin with. I mean, they've got follow-up funding options as well. And the model they followed in the medtech actuator is they essentially, they invest in these companies, and this company has to raise the second round on their own. So that sort of validates their investment. And if they get some other investors, the company gets some other investors in the second round, Artesian will follow up and maintain their equity position with another investment. So that was sort of the mechanism there. I think what Artesian really liked, and this is just purely from the feedback we got from pitch practices during the actuator program, was the big vision we had. The upside to what we were doing. We had a very clearly identified market gap and an opportunity. So there was no question on, would this sell if this comes out? That was never a question for us. The question was mostly technical risks. Artesian sort of really aligned with that big vision. IP Group was a lot more technical in their due diligence. So Artesian's arrangement with medtech actuator was, Artesian sort of comes from the financial side, and then the medtech actuator had people with the medical device industry experience. So you sort of have that combination of tech due diligence versus the financial due diligence. IP Group had a lot deeper due diligence process. It took us about a year to close that round. We got the offer, which we closed about 8 months in. But then, COVID hit in January, and then it took us a few more months to sort of clean things up as well, because startups do have a tendency to work quite informally. But then if an investor has a director coming on the company, everything needs to be clean for them to be able to do that, because directors are legally liable. So just that sort of restructuring for a few things took some more time. But IP Group's due diligence was very, very technical. It was like they asked some very, very good questions. And what that did was it sort of broke our bubble as well, because as a founder, you're really optimistic about some things. You're not thinking like very practically sometimes, because you figured that you'll find an answer to that question somehow later down the line. Right now, there are other things to move on. But then having an investor ask those questions, pressing on exactly, what would this be, actually accelerated our research as well. So what we were doing, and that really, really defined our strategy for what would happen after the IP Group raise. So that really, really helped us in that sense. So IP Group assigns a director. So we were quite fortunate to have their head of life sciences, and definitely good mentorship from them as the director, helping in whichever way they can. If it's about connecting to subject matter experts, they help with that. Just keeping us on track of financials as well. So overall, I think both the investors we worked with, we were very, very happy with them. The only thing that I sort of wish was if we would have raised a bigger round, if we would have been able to raise a bigger round.
Okay.
And that's where I sort of felt that the appetite for risk in Australia is very different to that in the United States, let's say. Because we were in pitching competitions, there were other teams who were also building magnetic stimulators. All they were doing is designing different stimulation protocols. So it wasn't even very disruptive. And those companies had raised $800K, $1 million US as their seed round, as their first investment round. So that difference really, really pinches. And it's basically what my assessment of the situation was: the more capital you have up front, the higher your chances of success, because you've got a lot more buffer. You've got more resources to make that thing happen. If you think with a 200K raise, you can't even hire 4 people, 4 engineers. So it's just like there's a minimum wage. There's a wage rate with engineering Australia. You can't even get that. So you're really, really struggling and hustling on your own. So having that capital early on allows you to actually bring the right people in and build what you were going to build. So this was something like an advice that I got from Bernie as well, who's the director of iLab at the time. And this was during one of the raises, because, if we raise 300K, that 300K almost certainly won't go anywhere because it's not enough to do something. But if you raise 600K, we can at least do what we were, planning to do with the 300K, because we've got a bit more. So that sort of approach really helped us. So I think for founders, raising capital, it depends. I mean, deep tech is a bit different. We don't have a revenue projection. It makes no sense in my mind to do that if your product's 10 years down the line. So yes, you need to have some idea that there's a good market, what's the current pricing of different products there. But showing projections that we will get these many dollars in 3 years is completely, hypothetical. Yeah, so I think our investment was experience with VCs was good. It's just that the risk appetite wasn't as much as I would have liked or hoped for. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that is a bit of a systemic issue in Australia and also cultural as well. We are very risk averse, I feel like, in a lot of ways. Yeah, that's an incredible story, incredible journey, and like, yeah, you clearly learn a lot despite not being able to continue and progress it into a product. But I wanted to ask, so as you were deciding, this is going to take too much money and way too long to sort of get it, it's still too early in the sort of development phase, did you consider potentially just selling whatever IP you already had or designs you had to a bigger company if you were closing shop, such as Cochlear?
We did. Yeah. So interestingly, when we were raising a second round, because Cochlear is based in Macquarie University, their headquarters. So they found out about us and they invited us there. So we flew there. We spoke to, it was just three of us, and it was a big building, and they were supposedly our biggest competitors, but also the most prospective acquirer as well. It was a bit overwhelming at first because three people against a giant company, $16 billion company, was it was that. But then they were very nice people. They really liked what we're doing. They said it's of obvious interest to us. But yeah, when you've got some more clinical data, like when you've got that clinical proof of concept, come back to us. We hadn't reached there when we were about to close, so we'd still reached out to them. I think they had a look as well, but decided against buying the IP. I think it was mostly because even the founders needed to get full-time jobs. So it wasn't like, as I said, I had a baby on the way, so I needed a full-time job. So it wasn't that Cochlear could invest a little bit and the startup can keep going. So a lot of the big companies would, invest little by little. So de-risking their investments.
Yeah.
At that early stage, an acquisition is really unheard of. In medical devices, my assessment is, and that's where it's interesting where pharma and medical devices differ. There's a perception that pharma takes a lot more money. It does in early stages, but it also gets acquired early on. So phase 1, phase 2, you've got successful results, you would typically have an acquisition there. So you've basically got a problem solution fit to demonstrate in pharma. That's my understanding. In medical devices, you almost need to go to product market fit, which is much, much later down the line. Almost show that, people are buying your products. You've got reimbursement approval, you've got regulatory approvals, all that stuff, which is much, much longer journey. So you end up putting almost the same amount of capital, if not more, into medical devices to get that exit. So medical device acquisitions are much, much later for a lot of things, like especially in the Cochlear space. We looked at, they have acquired companies in the past, and the ones they did were in that product market stage where essentially they had launched in certain markets and they were expanding, and that's when Cochlear took them up. So we were way too early for that. And not having that expertise with the founders, if we're just, giving the IP doesn't make sense for any acquirer. You need to have the founders with the tech because they only have the know-how. And what we were trying to build, I really doubt that anybody in Australia had the know-how to build that, because we did talk to recruiters for our potential Series A round. We just could not find the right talent pool in Australia as well. So that was another reason. People with the power electronics expertise were mostly in electric car powertrains. Not a lot happening here in that sense. So we had the hearing expertise. So when the decision to come to Australia was partially correct, because I did find people with hearing expertise. It started with when I was a student in UQ. I started interacting with ex-Cochlear people. So that space was there. But the magnetic stimulation designer, like making magnetic stimulators, was pretty much zero in my awareness. So that's where we really struggled. So we were building things from scratch, reinventing the wheel for a few things. Yeah. So again, Cochlear didn't have that expertise either. That's not their core technology. So they would have had to build that, do all those things again. So yeah, I understand why it didn't make sense for them to acquire this.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, incredible story. I would love to move on to sort of your current role now. Transitioned out of the startup, Augmented Bionics, and now you're in a commercial role at ANU. So what are you involved in exactly there? Are you working with researchers in universities to help commercialize their research, or what exactly is involved?
Yeah, pretty much. So we basically, I sit in the commercialization and IP team. Our role is essentially, as I said previously, to get ideas from the lab to market. But we are sort of, if you imagine a relay race, the first person is the inventor or the researcher. And let's say the finish line is your first sale of a product. There would be people in between where you pass the thing to. So I'm sort of the second person, where my role is essentially to take that tech and develop, let's say, guide the development. I don't do technical development myself. It's mostly guiding the technical development in a certain state direction based on market feedback. So most of my job is to reach out to companies to see if there's a market need for this. If yes, then we sort of make a decision to file an IP around it, all those things. And then, essentially, can we license this, or can we create a spin out around this to commercialize this? So getting that, my role sort of is between taking that tech from the inventor and putting it into an industrial vehicle, which could be an established industry or a new startup that the researcher might lead. So helping the researcher in all areas in that journey. It's a bit tricky because on one side we are almost like business developers. So if you imagine each technology as a startup of its own, we sort of act as the business development people for that tech. But on the other side, we've also got a finite university budget to put into patents and time costs of us as well. So we are also doing due diligence on technologies, whether this makes sense to invest money into patents for this. Is there a market need at all? So we sort of act as both business development people, but also investors, albeit with a very smaller budget. But yeah, and the due diligence is consecutively smaller, but still we have that dual role, and which makes it a bit tricky because if there's a no, it sort of creates tensions within with us and the researchers, because the researchers are like, it's just a patent, why can't you give us a patent? And then we are like, there is no market need for this. Nobody wants this essentially. So why should we spend that resources filing a patent? It's better if you publish it. You might get industry interest as a capability to partner with something. So there are other ways to monetize research. It's not just through IP commercialization. So that's where we struggle. And then, we need to find that balance. So we do try to pivot the technology a little bit wherever possible, but it becomes difficult because, like startups, one thing that I've learned is that our academic researchers struggle with funding pretty much the same way that startups do. It's just that sometimes, like, if you've got a good track record and previous grants, you get higher probability of success. But it's the same case with founders. If you've got previous companies that you've started, multiple, like serial entrepreneurs, have probably a higher chance of success in getting bigger rounds of money. It's the same. What I really like about this is exposure to so many different industries. So as I said, I started pretty much industry agnostic because of the biomedical engineering background is actually pretty good in this sense, because you understand enough of biology, but you also understand enough of physics and engineering to pretty much start understanding any technological area. And augmented bionics, like our tech was so complex that we, as I said, like there were like 7 disciplines of knowledge that we had to build on, spanning life sciences and material sciences, all that stuff. So it helped me to build understandings from the ground up in so many different areas. So I've got solar technologies, photovoltaics, I've got hydrogen, some chemicals as well. Medical devices, without going into specific details of what they do. But yeah, about 20 technologies that I'm managing at the moment. Yeah, so good exposure.
That would be very exciting, I guess, being across all these different technical areas.
Yeah.
I can see why that would be interesting and fun, like as a job. I have a lot of thoughts and questions I want to ask you around commercialization of research. I've been spending the past probably year trying to learn more about it, talking to researchers, figuring out, because there seems to be a massive gap. I think Australia produces a lot of great research in universities, billions of dollars worth of this research, but the commercial outcome of it doesn't seem to be there. There's some problem, some resistance in the system where there's a lot of great research, but we're not seeing the tangible products coming out from that. So I want to ask, why is that? Is it because I know you mentioned with UQ, and that is the case where UQ owns the IP from the researchers. Is it the same case at ANU, or do...
Yeah, so that's a pretty... so I was specifically talking about PhD students, but beyond that, it's a standard sort of rule or a law, where if you're employed by a company, any company, doesn't matter if it's a university or not, any intellectual property you create during your role, as part of your role, is the company's intellectual property, because essentially they've paid you to do it. So that's the general principle. Where universities might differ is if something is commercialized, how much of that revenue would go back to the researcher. So in this case, ANU is actually pretty good because 50% goes to the inventors. With other universities, it's about a third. There might be other universities with 50%, I'm not very sure, but my general understanding is that ANU is quite unique in that. I don't think that's the main reason. There are a lot of reasons where research sort of doesn't go into the commercial pipeline, and I'm sort of facing those now. One is that obviously lack of early stage capital, enough capital, so that we faced as a startup as well, but I see our researchers struggling with that as well. You have to understand that Australia is a country with, the size of population of New Delhi. That's one city in India. So you can only have a finite amount of wealthy people, and most wealth is generated in mining or real estate. So that startup ecosystem is yet to develop, where you've got founders, many founders, reaching like $1 billion acquisitions and then coming back with that money and expertise to reinvest. So it's a cyclical process, which is starting to happen now. We've got some good acquisitions from Australia as well. The other thing that I've found is the location is pretty bad, geographical location, and I say that in the context of we don't have a lot of industries here. You need that proximity with industry to have that ecosystem with the the value chain, right? So or let's say the technology readiness level. So for industry to absorb technologies, the industry sits on the right side of the value chain. The creators, let's say, sit on the left side of the value chain. The valley of death is the valley of death. But if you don't have a lot of these industries locally, it becomes very difficult to pull that innovation through. So licensing, a lot of it happens with overseas companies. Licensing still happens. There are conflicting priorities as well. Some companies like to do things in-house, so they don't have much of an in-licensing thing, but some do. So what most of the companies, would be outside Australia, because we don't have a lot of industry in a lot of areas of production, let's say, because we don't have that manufacturing. It's difficult to have those technologies uptaken. So often we find, like with the solar technologies, we have to partner with someone who has a large solar manufacturing facility in China. So there is no big solar facility in Australia. It could be China, it could be someone else. Like India's got a lot of solar production as well. So it's just that, and because there's no industry, there's no know-how locally. So you've almost completely missed that picture of what exactly do you need to do to get this from a prototype to an industrial product. So that's one gap that I think purely funding into research is not going to address, even if we have early stage startup capital. It's that people missing from the right side of the value chain is where it lacks. That's one. I think appetite to risk, as we've discussed previously, is another thing where generally, like, we don't see a lot of appetite for risk, but technologies fail as well. I mean, ours was one example where the tech itself wasn't ready. We have multiple examples in my current role as well. Like, I've gotten projects from companies to evaluate the technology, and the technology just didn't deliver. So it's a risky game in that sense. So there are so many different risks along the way. Hydrogen, there's no proper regulation at the moment. So you can't commercialize something if there's no safety standards around it. So that's again something. So a lot of the things are pre-industry. So hydrogen is one. Next generation of photovoltaics, I think perovskite solar cells is another one. Quantum is another one where there's no, like, it's all pre-industry. So it's very difficult then to have that uptake of technologies because the whole industry needs to be developed from scratch. So yeah, there are a lot of factors that are going in here. I wouldn't purely blame the government for not putting enough money. I don't think that's the case. R&D tax incentive is very, very good. Universities do get a lot of funding, hence the research. But yeah, we almost need to build industries to uptake our technologies.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are you finding that with the research and the technology that you do commercialize, are you finding that you're licensing it out more to bigger companies, or are you actually spinning out startups with researchers? Are researchers wanting to actually turn their research into a product
I think,
and a startup,
that's
or
the
are they
default
not
position.
interested?
Yeah, so I think the spin out thing is always, almost all the time, the default position. I think it's also a glorified way of looking, overly optimistic way of looking things, because from my own experience of my company, not everything is suitable for a startup. What we found is that, especially if it's a process innovation, it makes sense to license that to a big company which already has like a manufacturing setup to implement that process. For a startup, it really needs to be a scalable product or a scalable service. So that's where you need to really, really think that, is this even suitable for a startup? So that's where our office tries to guide the researchers as well, is that, yes, you've got this thing, there's a market need also, but this is more suitable for an industry to take over rather than making a company around it. But there are cases where, so ANU is quite open with that. If the researcher wants to do a startup, we don't just say don't do that. We'll sort of try to mentor them, try to find what's the best opportunity for them to have that startup. But yeah, I mean, it's not everything suitable for a startup. There are definitely techs which are better for licensing. So we try to find that balance between the two.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you find that researchers have the appetite to want to build a startup, or are they more interested in doing science and research as opposed to building a company and everything that goes along with that?
Person to person, again, there are definitely researchers who are quite entrepreneurial. There's a spectrum, right? So there, on one extreme side would be people who want to lead their own startup, just get out of academia, and that's their way of having built something valuable. Sort of coming back a little side on that spectrum would be researchers who would, yes, want a startup, but would only want to act in an advisory capacity. So they would still want to retain their full-time academic position. Then there are researchers who really like what they're doing. They just want impact, commercial impact. Let it be. So they're very happy with licensing to big companies. And then there are researchers that they want nothing to do with commercialization whatsoever. So they don't even come to us. People have different ways. We don't tell our researchers what to do, what not to do. They're generating knowledge. That's their core role. And that's where it sort of becomes different to a startup again. And it's a lot of my job is stakeholder management. Is commercialization is not the metric of success for our academics. At the end of the day, it's a byproduct of their research. So how do you develop something when that's not the main goal of a person? It could be a personal goal. If it is, then it's easier for us to do that. But a lot of the times, like then when researchers don't have the bandwidth to work on a particular innovation, even if the market is just wanting it. We've had cases where, the companies are just wanting that, but the inventor had no bandwidth to work on that tech, so we just deferred it. So there's so many different factors. And what I found from this job is a lot of exposure into stakeholder management. How do you get someone to do something when one, they don't report to you, and then secondly, it's not their direct metric of success. So indirect sort of way of working with someone. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So now, I'd love to ask, with all your knowledge now, obviously, in startups and what you've done there and now your commercial role, what advice would you give your younger self, or maybe someone who is in a position where you were early in your career, they want to build something, or maybe they want to commercialize something in the deep tech space? Do you have any words of advice for someone in that position?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this sort of comes from advice that I got along the way as well from different advisors and mentors. So the first one, I think, and this is still I'm struggling with that, is a company at the end of the day is a group of people. You need to find the best people. End of story. If you don't have the right talent, you'll just be reinventing the wheel. So find the right people. Keep finding till you don't start till you get the right people. You can start and then just struggle, and then anyway you'll need to wait till you find good people to take things forward. It becomes difficult in certain fields where there are a lot more opportunities in the US, so there's a talent drain happening in that side. It happens a lot in India, where I'm from. I mean, I'm a talent drain. I came to Australia, but finding the best people is one thing. The other thing I would go for startups, especially in deep tech, is always follow a risk-based approach. So find what's the most risky aspect of your business and solve that, like put the money to solve that first. Everything else should be hustle. Okay. So that's where I sort of differ in my opinion with the second accelerator program, where we were almost forced to, it was mandatory to work with consultants to develop business case. That wasn't the main risk in our business. Our main risk was, can this thing work? Can this thing make someone hear something? We would have been much better off having done our own research, which, by the way, TGA has documentation, FDA has documentation. If you can read English, you can read that. You can upskill yourself for a basic level. You won't be obviously replacing an expert. You can have a basic plan from your own hustle, but your capital should be deployed to the most risky aspect of your business. For us, it was tech, so I still believe it should have all gone to that tech part until it reaches a stage where it makes sense to spend money on business case. But if it is business case, if the tech is fairly straightforward, the product is straightforward, what you need is customer acquisition, market validation. Spend your resources there. So it has to be a risk-based approach, especially in capital raising. Like, we met companies who were doing neuromodulation, 40 million round of investment, 60 million round of investment, and I asked them, like, we're barely able to raise a few 100,000. How are you raising tens of millions of dollars? So that's the advice I got. Follow that risk-based approach. That would be the other one. The other one I think, like I saw from a post on LinkedIn from a startup panel, was as a founder, you need to be a brown belt in everything. So that's something I really tried hard to achieve at my end, which obviously it's a struggle because if you're dealing with something very complex, each field is a PhD of its own. So you have to be a generalist, but you have to be a good generalist where you're like a brown belt in everything. But again, coming back to the team thing, you need to hire the black belts in your specific domains. But as a founder, you need to upskill yourself to be prepared for that. The other thing, I think the last thing which we did do right was have a big vision. If you don't have a very big vision, yes, I mean, you might get a short-term success, surely, but for what we were building, it was so difficult. This is sort of moving into Steve Jobs' motivation speech territory. But startups are hard, man. Like, they're really, really hard. And in my opinion, deep tech's even harder because it's a lot more resource intensive. So you need to have a very clear reason on why you're doing that. For me, it was until I had a baby, it was, any suffering that I have is a lot less than the suffering my end users would have. If someone's not hearing, they would have a lot of problems in their life, and there are 70 million people out there with that market need. So I can go through all these struggles, but it's worth me going through this if I can deliver a solution at the end of it. When I had a baby, that was a different story, because then other people's struggles did not matter to me. I need to provide for my child, so whatever way allows me to do that, I'll do that. So interesting thing.
Yeah.
Personal risk appetite is something, again, what I found was it's a balance. I found that younger people have much higher risk appetite. They don't have a lot to lose. They don't have families to feed. They don't have a mortgage. And that's why I started very early, because I saw, one of the startups I worked in, the guy had a kid to raise, was on a lot of loans and did not have the revenue to pay those loans back. So I was like, that's not something that I'm doing. Don't leverage debt.
Yeah.
But what I found was having inexperienced people, such as myself, even, like I'm included in that. This was my first time starting a company. You do make a lot of mistakes, and there's a learning curve to it. So one advice I got from a mentor was, hire for the aptitude, not really the skill sets. I sort of, at the end of my startup journey, definitely disagree with that. There's a time and cost to learning skills. If you have that, well and good. If I was building a SaaS company, there's enough talent pool to, have that knowledge base and have people learn. If I'm building something that influences the nerves in the human mind, that's not something that can be learned in 6 months. It takes years and years, and there's a cost to that. So I'd rather start with people who already know decently. So my rule of thumb would be get people who can do at least the status quo, and then your learning cost or time gets spent on building the new thing. So start with that people who have that status quo. So that would be, again, ties in with the team, but like more defined way of finding those people.
Yeah, that's some fantastic advice. I really appreciate that, particularly your comment around having a really, really big vision. And I guess you have to be obsessed with the problem you're solving.
Yeah.
And make sure it's big enough. I think that's something we did wrong, and something I'm learning now is you listen to people like Sam Altman, who used to work at Y Combinator.
Yeah.
And what they've said is it's almost better to work on a really hard problem compared to a simple problem, because one, it's a big vision, other people want to invest in you, and it also draws the best talent. I think that's something we did wrong with Neurotech, is the vision wasn't big enough and we weren't solving something hard enough, which is, I reckon, probably one of my best takeaways. Because starting something simple is still very hard. You're just competing with everyone else now. You still have to build a profitable business, and you're competing with everyone else trying to do the same thing. Whereas if you're doing something really, really hard, you're one of the few people in the world trying to do it. Yeah, it's technically challenging, but you're drawing the best talent, you're getting money, and you're working towards something that's really important.
Yeah. And that's I found that
Yeah.
I almost put startup founders in two buckets. One is a practical founder with that shorter term thing and a clear path to acquisition, and then there are these founders will have so much vision, and very different journeys. So I would say that in a shorter thing, the probability of success could be higher because you need to put in less time, and you can get acquired by the companies relatively easily. But yeah, with the long term thing, it's again a difference between whether you want to have a successful financial outcome, whether versus you want to solve a major problem of the world. There are financial upsides to that as well, but I think that's where things differ, and that's where also it's interesting where some people are like customer is right, but then other people are like customer doesn't even know what they want. So it's that difference. When you're solving some major challenges, it's always in the case that customer has no idea that they even have this problem and there's a potential solution to it. Our interviews with cochlear implant users were very similar. Like they couldn't even foresee that this could be done without surgery. They were very happy with the ability to hear. That's good, but they almost forgot the pain, years of pain they went through having an implant in their head all the time to do that. But yeah, so that's the two different motivations I think really work. So don't start a company for the sake of starting a company. It needs to be a problem that you want to solve and are passionate about. Yeah.
Awesome.
There's
All right,
risks
so
as
final
well.
question.
Yeah, final question.
Yeah. So last question for you. What is your vision of the future in terms of what is your personal vision? What do you want out of your future, and what do you see, just I guess in general, what do you want to see in the world going into the future?
Sure. And this is where I want to go back in the startup game, but I don't believe I have the right skill set just yet to start this particular thing. We've got ChatGPT, which is a good example of generative text. They've got DALL-E, which is generative images. What I would like to really work on is generative innovation or inventions. So the problem that I faced was when I was designing these engineering tools on these CAD softwares and finite element simulations, things like that. They're very good softwares because they're doing complex maths problems. They're solving things for us, but they're really, really dumb in optimizing them, optimizing the designs. I used to spend days, and most of the combinations of variables that I put in were errors. So not because it was an erroneous combination, it's just the software failed. So there's a TED talk by a guy in generative AI who works with Autodesk as well. So that's where I want to see things going, is can you use AI to invent things? And this is already happening in the pharma space. So there's a company called In Silico Medicine that is completely doing AI designed drugs. So that's good. It works for chemistry. I would like to see a little bit of that in medical devices as well. But even material sciences, design a material that has these properties. How do you look at existing materials, things like that. So as computation moves forward, and as generative AI moves forward, I would like to have that sort of a thing where, that would be something that I'm interested in building.
Yeah, I love that. I've been researching a bit about generative design and generative design algorithms, and it is the future, I think, of just all types of product design and engineering. It's going to be crazy because, engineers are going to be out of jobs potentially. We're just going to be able to create these wonderful things. You'll input your parameters and what you need, and then it'll optimize the design and iterate over time. I think that's a big area. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see AI and how it's going to permeate across all industries and sort of transform every industry over the coming years.
Yeah.
It's crazy. All right, awesome. Well, that was a great podcast. I guess final thing is, if people want to get in contact with you or learn about you, where could they go to
I think they can
reach
find
out?
me on LinkedIn would be the best one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. All right, well, Viraj, thank you so much for joining me. This was Yeah, I learned a lot. So this was a great conversation. And yeah, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, mate. Bye-bye.